Yes, it's Facebook and
Okay.
Twitter. Yeah, that's what I'll do.
Yeah. It says it's preparing.
Hi, ma'am. How you doing?
Hi, Mike. Look,
Hey, we met a long time ago when you were working with Colonel Hall.
You like show up in full regalia. That's like overachieving in our work or study from home.
The Navy did it last week, so I had to at least meet what they did. So
that's funny.
Yes. So congrats on retirement.
Good to good to reconnect with you.
Absolutely. Yeah.
It's so good to see the like your representative of talent that has been a part of CMU and the War College program.
The Navy did it last week.
Such a great opportunity.
Yeah, it definitely is. Had to at least meet what they did. So
that's funny.
So do you have the YouTube channel playing?
Whoops. Do I?
Yes.
Yep.
We're getting some, there's delay between the live streaming. And so I think that's why we were hearing back. I had to mute mine as well.
Sorry, everyone. Here, I'm going to get it up and then mute it. Okay, there we go.
Okay, thank you.
We're still learning best practices for these things.
Yeah, and I think in all the different collaboration forums, I mean, in the last, just today, I've done Zoom, I've done Skype, I've done Teams. Yeah, we're all in a FaceTime, I guess, as well.
So I think right at 4:45, we'll let everyone in and I'll introduce Mike and we get started.
Okay.
So we have a few minutes.
Okay. Mike, you're in Orsa.
Yes, that's correct, ma'am.
So please don't call me ma'am. In fact, it's like it's really cool to be incognito. Have you worked with Doug Maddy before?
I was several years ago when I was in the proponent shop. He was in G8 at the time, so I worked with him then, and then know that he's not far from here at the AI task force. So
because I feel like his early work and as well as General Ferrari's work, the Orsas were kind of like one of our great models for the cyber branch.
Right. Yeah. So. Yeah, just as I was mentioning right before you came on, looking back at that point in time, I mean, there was just, a lot of that work in order to create the branch, and then to see how it's, developed to date has, been impressive.
I know, right?
To look back at. So.
Yeah, it's good stuff.
Absolutely.
You can't boil the ocean. You have to, start with small steps.
Right.
But
definitely.
That it, in the long run, will come together in ways that are way better than you could have imagined from the beginning.
Sure.
Who was on? Who from the Navy was on last week?
They had a panel of I think 4 commanders, lieutenant, talking women in technology and stuff. So
good stuff.
Yeah.
I just rattled off all the names while I was muted. We have Captain Ann Casey, Captain Tracy Hines, Captain Danielle Lukic, Senior Chief Shirley Dulux, and Lieutenant Sabrina Reyes Dodds.
Oh, okay. So of course, it's always a small world. I do know Ann. And
do you really?
Cyber Command, yeah, she's fantastic.
Nice.
Brigadier General Buckner, if I could say something real quick, part of my role here is to create some content, both video and written for our websites. And so I want to let you know I'm planning on writing a little something about this event for the website, but that you'll have full editorial control over it on the back end. So I'll send it to you before I do anything with it. So don't feel like you need to censor yourself or anything like that.
Okay. Yeah, just whatever, just make me sound smart.
I don't know, from our conversation this afternoon, I don't think I'll have to work that hard to do that.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and let the folks in from the waiting room, and we'll go ahead and get started.
Okay.
Sound good? Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'd like to start by introducing Lieutenant Colonel Mike Needham, who is the Army War College Fellow here in the Institute for Politics and Strategy this academic year. Lieutenant Colonel.
Thank you, Allie. As Allie mentioned, I'm Lieutenant Colonel Michael Needham, an Army War College Fellow, and would like to thank you for attending today's CIRP Policy Forum event, Cyber Operations, a Military Practitioner's Perspective. I have the honor to introduce Brigadier General Retired Jennifer Buckner. Jen currently leads Mastercard's Technology Risk Management, Global Governance Framework and Standards team, providing enhanced visibility and proactive management of security and technology risks. Jen is recently retired U.S. Army Brigadier General who held numerous intelligence and leadership positions throughout her military career. In her last government role, Jen served as the Director of Cyber for the United States Army, where she led governance and oversight of cyber capabilities and championed emerging technologies to enable detection and disruption of significant cyber threats. In operational roles, Jen shaped U.S. Cyber Command's response to major cyber events attributed to nation-state adversaries, focused on mitigating the threat of cyber attacks. She currently supports the U.S. Army as a highly qualified expert and senior mentor, and also serves in an advisory role with several cyber-related initiatives. In her role with Mastercard, Jen continues to champion diversity and inclusion in STEM, public service partnerships, and cybersecurity talent initiatives. It is my honor to welcome Brigadier General Retired Jen Buckner.
Hey, thanks so much, Mike. Good afternoon, good evening, and since we're live streaming, perhaps good morning to some in other parts of the world. I am really thrilled to be here with you virtually. I am energized, I am inspired, and I'm really grateful to share this platform with you. And quick at the beginning, a shout out to Allie, first of all, for the invitation and your persistence in pulling this together. I also want to just shout out to Dr. Kieran Skinner, who has been a champion and partner with Army Cyber for so long, actually since the beginning, and to faculty and students across the Institute for Politics and Strategy. Your support of this forum, your commitment to the cause of thought leadership in cyber policy and national security, and certainly the innovation to pivot this platform and your classrooms to this, larger virtual gathering. As Mike mentioned, I am recently retired or transitioned from the U.S. Army and a career in public service. And I now currently work with Mastercard in the technology risk space, which is inclusive of cybersecurity. And I like to think that I am continuing this mission of defense and protection of critical infrastructure, just playing a little bit of a different position or role in, what I would consider to be a national or international team sport. But I pivot to industry, but of course, at the beginning, I was a student in STEM, an officer in the Army, a leader in the military. And I really want to start by talking a little bit about my time in the Army, because it's really where I learned about the superpower of teamwork. And the big thing about the Army is that you learn early on that in order to be successful, you really need to be able to operate as part of a team. So I'll start with a war story, if I might, and it is literally war. So it was 2008, and I was deployed to Iraq as part of a joint task force. Leading a team of soldiers and civilians is about 600 people. We were spread across 40 different locations from north to south in Iraq. We were missioned to field and operationalize a special technical capability to forces across the country. It was called SIGINT Terminal Guidance, and it supported the geolocation and targeting of terrorists and their support networks. So this had been a niche capability that was tested and employed only by elite special operations forces. But we were now going to proliferate this technology first to intelligence personnel so that they could perform the detailed analysis of threat insurgent networks. And then we would put it in the hands of infantry and combat forces to employ the technically sophisticated geolocation equipment in a way that enabled time-sensitive targeting, but also protected the sensitive technology. So this system, in the hands of combat forces, ultimately supported the detention of hundreds, if not thousands, of insurgents, removed them from the battlefield, and led to an inflection point in the war. And we were able to transition from US-led operations to Iraqi-led. So I started my year of deployment with US forces in the lead, and we left with Iraqi forces in the lead. And that's such a success story. And I'm so proud that this technology saved the lives of not only our own forces, but more significantly, those of Iraqi civilians. So this was a huge turning point for me, or a learning point, if you will. The power of technology for security, and the opportunity to put emerging technologies in the hands of users to do good at scale. Ultimately, the power of technology to make the world a safer place, a better place. And now, I guess, to some recent press, actually, a second war story, and more recent and a completely different type of war fighting or combat. So this is now documented publicly as a part of Dina Temple-Raston's NPR reporting entitled "How the US Hacked ISIS." US Cyber Command's Operation Glowing Symphony was the first large-scale offensive cyber operation to directly counter and combat ISIS, their seemingly uncontested use of the internet. So it was the culmination of months of intelligence gathering, planning, interagency coordination, a lot of levels of approval, coalition partner coordination, and a reflection of a small but elite group of people who were organized as this Joint Task Force Ares. So remember the context here. So it was mid to late 2015. Our military was at a crossroads about how to respond to this, new, increasingly capable terrorist group. So this was a group that was significantly improved from its early comparisons as, I think, quote unquote, a ragtag team of Iraqi Islamists or amateurs, if you will. They were now something much bigger, an unusually capable fighting force that was, not only seized and was holding territory in Iraq and Syria, but had found a way to do something that other terrorist groups had not been successful, or actually nation state adversaries too hadn't been successful at. They were weaponizing the internet. So ISIS routinely used encrypted apps for communication, command and control, social media, and really, lossy online magazines and videos to spread its message, find recruits, garner financial aid and even logistics support, and actually launch attacks too, coordinate attacks. So to use military terms, they enjoyed freedom of maneuver and action in the virtual space. So a response to ISIS at this time required a new kind of warfare, and candidly one that US Cyber Command had advocated and planned for since its inception in 2010, but it hadn't been authorized to do. And I think it's really become clear today, and what we spent some time talking about in a smaller group earlier, was that inaction in this space does not serve as a deterrent, nor is it effective in shaping norms or behavior in the domain. So I want to caveat a little bit. So I did not participate directly in Operation Glowing Symphony, but from my position as the Deputy Commander of Cyber National Mission Force, I did work for General Nakasone at this time. He directed, but we all understood how important this was in terms of setting a precedent and demonstrating capabilities, deliberate planning processes, transparent targeting, precision effects. And this was the way that we were going to break the dam, so to speak, and change course. So we hand selected our best talent for this group. Operationally savvy, technically gifted, our best and brightest, many of whom were arrogant, but in a really good way. And we didn't need a lot of people, we needed the right people. So we handpicked our young operators, our junior personnel, who understood hacking in a very different way. And in many respects, they were able to visualize what we needed in this space better than any of the leadership. And that's, that was really an important lesson for us. So we enabled them to have a direct line to decision makers to craft this sophisticated operation. I want to tell you that the operation itself was a bit anticlimactic if you were watching it in real time, because waging war in cyberspace, you were actually just sitting at a keyboard. So it's kind of funny. But look, after months of looking at web pages and understanding accounts and picking their way through ISIS networks, they started logging in and masquerading as the enemy. They deleted files, they changed passwords. They, in some cases, it was relatively unsophisticated when you think about it, but it was very deliberate. It was very well informed. And it was the start. It wasn't like one, large blow that cut it all off. It was actually interactive and reflecting the dynamic nature of the space. So one action compelled another action, which required a response, and thus begins what virtual warfare looks like. As Garrett Graff's Wired profile of General Nakasone, so it came out yesterday, it's a pretty good read about the history of US Cyber Command, and I feel like it was like the perfect press piece in preparation for this. We see now a new proactive strategy to counter online threats that reflects Cyber Command's evolution since 2010, as I mentioned. It's from a reactive and a defensive posture to a more proactive and effective posture called persistent engagement. Bill, you and I talked about that a little bit earlier. Look, we learned that we cannot afford to wait for us to be attacked, that defending requires executing operations in other people's space and touching the enemy or adversary all the time. And look, so those ISIS operations, they did break the proverbial dam, and the threat evolved, and Cybercom is evolving right along with it. So how does one follow that act? So I was a deputy commander of Joint Task Force Ares following that large operation, and we continued that disruption, if you will, over a period of time. So in 2015, when they had really uncontested use of the internet to really decimate it in a big way, and then of course aligned with combat operations on the ground in Iraq and Syria, I think that was the first time that we've coordinated those two to have an effect on the adversary, and in 2017 in a much different place in a good way. So how do you follow that act? And as many of you consider your next move following school or the next job, I'll share a bit about the reason that I came to Mastercard after the Army, and it's about joining a team that's similarly committed to using technology for global good. I wanted to be a part of a team where I was going to lead people in the protection and defense of critical infrastructure, while also doing some good. In this case, Mastercard champions financial inclusion and access in a way that resonated with me and my values. I'll pivot a little bit. The teamwork and that I've come to value as part of the Army, whether leading soldiers in peacetime or in combat, is being replicated now in what I'm doing as part of our cybersecurity team at Mastercard. We bring experts across multidisciplinary specialties, that's threat intelligence, that's data science, that's emerging technologies, to support and protect our customers against an increasingly complex cyber threat environment. And I'm here today because I grew up in the Army, and I'm all about service and placing the needs of others, before your own, if you will. And I think that's really why you're here as a part of this program as well, is taking your talents and applying them in service or doing good. And I think, even in this most challenging of virtual times, if you will, I think that we can find unity of purpose, inspiration, if you will, in acts of service. And cybersecurity is this place where, you know, the insurance and the integrity of information and ultimately the protection of truth is really where we land. As we approach the 2020 elections, I think that's even more important. We know that cybersecurity is also fundamentally a team sport. And so being called a good teammate is kind of the ultimate compliment, whether you're in the Army or you're part of a cybersecurity team. And I have always felt that camaraderie in the Army. And I think, you know, I would challenge you to find that same sense of purpose in whatever it is you're doing, your commitment to your studies, or, you know, any job or any volunteer service as well. I wanted to quickly highlight, I think what Mike mentioned in terms of some advisory roles. And actually my connection with Mastercard came through my work with the Partnership for Public Service and specifically the Cyber Talent Initiative, which is aimed at exposing students to and incentivizing a start in public service. So we try to match graduates or mid-career transitioning mid-career talent with opportunities in the US government. So Department of Homeland Security, the Veterans Administration, the Department of Defense, the FBI, CIA. 2 years of the Cyber Talent Initiative offers 2 years of employment in a role in one of those agencies. I've worked directly with these teams while I was in uniform. I cannot think of a better way to gain not only industry and leadership experience, but also work with incredible talent and perhaps gain a security clearance and learn mission focus and the true value of working as part of a team. At the end of those 2 years, you then have the opportunity to transition to a job at Mastercard or Microsoft or Workday or a few other corporate sponsors. We as a company, along with those other corporate sponsors, recognize the value of service, the idea that you've been working as a part of a legal, moral, and ethical guidelines across government. And I promise you, you'll be better for the experience. I'm also really excited to be a part of Mastercard's Girls for Tech program. And it's a website, it's a curriculum, it's a virtual platform to develop and strengthen technical skills for kids in grade school. And I feel like it's just the right program at the right time, you know, those in need of a challenge outside of a traditional classroom. So I will just wrap up my time at Mastercard and the Army in comparing them. I have always found myself in the company of greatness, you know, and today, my last job at the Pentagon, here at Mastercard, so many leaders in our company who make us successful and make it an incredible place to work. Here's what we have in common. They foster an environment of leadership, innovation, collaboration, ownership, empowered execution, imagination, creativity, the safety to try new things, which was really important in Cyber Command. Also important, the safety to try and fail and then try again. I am currently kind of on this path of compassion and radical empathy in the technology space and emotional intelligence. So you've been in this space for now, you know, more than 30 years. I contrast this with my first job in the 82nd Airborne Division. I was a second lieutenant. I was one of 5 female junior officers in a division of 15,000 paratroopers. It's funny when I think back to that time, it was, I loved being a part of that team, but my experience today shows really how far we've come. I think I work now across a team that is actually a majority women. So as we kind of approach the next couple, the next 40 minutes to talk about some of these things, I guess I would highlight that, you know, I've been a part of some incredible teams. I understand my role in working as a part of that team, and being a great teammate is really a superpower. And so I would challenge all of you to consider that, you know, certainly we are in the pursuit of individual excellence and achievements, But I think even in the technology space, I would always prioritize being a great teammate over raw technical talent. And we do have some really important technology challenges to solve as citizens. And I have met a couple of you in the smaller groups doing really great work to date. And I think many of you represent the talent that we need for these really hard problems in the future. And with that, I will pause and I look forward to your questions. And Ali, I'm going to post a couple links in the chat. I don't think I can chat with everyone, so if you could pass those, because I draw from some public discourse, and I love the idea that we can talk about this now because it's in the public domain, and I offer a couple references that have been in the media recently.
Sounds great. I will absolutely pass those along to everyone.
Okay.
It's just one of our security features we have on that, for
That's
the
what I love to hear.
function.
See,
I figured it was on
good
theme.
job.
Thanks. So as usual in our Q&As for this virtual setting for this semester, we are going to start with our master's students. If we have any folks on the call, I know we have a couple of our master's students here. If any of you want to raise your hand and ask Brigadier General Buckner a question, please do so. I'm happy to take questions anonymously via the chat function as well, if you want me to ask them on your behalf. And otherwise, use your raise hand function. And if you're able to turn on your camera when you ask your question, please do so. So with that said, Alex O, please go ahead.
Hello. Hi, thanks so much for coming. Really enjoyed the talk so far. So my question kind of deals with something you touched upon, which is ISIS's kind of role in using social media and Facebook and stuff like that. And I was wondering if we should be holding these large tech companies accountable, and if so, to what degree?
Great question. And the subject of increasingly sophisticated, I think, policy and legislative discussions. And the fact that we see tech companies in these being held to account, for example, in congressional testimony, I think is really indicative of that. So I told a story earlier, which I'll repeat here. In 2010, actually the first offensive operation that I ever planned, never executed, was an operation. So some of the early glossy terrorist propaganda, it was called Inspire Magazine, and they were publishing materials like how to make a bomb in the kitchen of your mom. And it was really a how-to guide that appealed to a much broader audience. At the time, I had some informal discussions with friends of mine who were in the policy space for places like YouTube and Google, and it was really clear back then that we weighted freedom of speech and freedom of action on the internet, and so there was a very clear line on child pornography, not allowed. They would absolutely delete that. But the other stuff, it wasn't really culminating in any meaningful way, and you really had to go digging for it. So they kind of, really erred on the side of leaving it up. But clearly ISIS and its propaganda, its weaponization of the internet, and I think, showing beheadings was really a turning point that caused then, the deliberate use cases. And, and so we found actually that citing user agreements that you could actually trigger their removal of that objectionable content. So I think, I think that, today technology leaders understand that they do have a role in governing the platforms that they operate in a responsible way. You see that even today, like literally today, with the throttling of mis and disinformation involving the election. So look, it's a very dynamic space, and I don't think that there's any one singular policy or law that will govern that, it's got to be cumulative, but we clearly have we can look back and see some real turning points where public opinion really starts to influences the governance of these platforms in more responsible ways. And crafting policy in this space, I think, is one of the mandates that many students like you across CMU really are charged to do.
Thank you.
Gabriella.
Okay, so my question, first off, thank you for coming. My question is, there are some experts that are saying that the next war is going to start and end within nanoseconds. So how can the United States, both publicly and in the private sector, prepare itself for this conflict space that's going to increasingly rely on the cyber and information domains rather than like the kinetic domains?
I think so great question. And I think you bring up a really interesting point that I'm not sure that it's, that warfare in the traditional form of combat is, I'm not sure our adversaries kind of understand it in the way that we do. The competition or conflict, it doesn't matter. I think our adversaries recognize that the information space, that you can achieve a strategic win without ever kind of firing a bullet in the kinetic or physical realm. And I think one way we combat this is not to wait, is that we know that we have to be engaged in the space all the time. That's why you see that the current policy of persistent engagement recognizes that you can't wait, that, we have to be out engaging in the space all the time, understanding how our adversaries are using that and influencing and shaping that in small measure, because in small measure, that's how we, in aggregate, that's how we bring together, shape these norms. And, I'm not sure that we, as the United States or our partners or the adversary has there's not one single act that's going to change. It's really more, it's happening every day, all day. And so that's really the way that we have to approach it. We can't just wait to be attacked. We can't just wait, for some threshold or red line, if you will. It's happening around us all the time, and we have to be a part of it.
Thank you.
Harrison.
Good afternoon, ma'am. Thank you for speaking. I enjoyed hearing your brief introduction as well as some of the background. In today's environment, there's a lot of teams, whether cybersecurity or otherwise, being stood up that don't necessarily have very clearly defined purposes. When they're stood up, they just are stood up to, quote, do cyber type things. And you were in cyber on the ground floor. I'm kind of curious how you would suggest finding purpose and direction in an environment where you may not have monetary or political capital to actually execute on anything you're able to produce.
Well, I feel like we bring a lot of, so I'm a real advocate of multidiscipline teams. And when you bring them together, to look at problems or, hard challenges that they can solve or advance the cause in the space. And I think, we have obviously high-end offensive teams, but I'm also really thrilled at the way that that the National Guard, that the reserves have partnered with local and state governments to, for example, add a degree of or layered defense in protecting critical infrastructure, to protecting the integrity of their local, election offices, if you will. And I'm not sure we would have envisioned that, but I think that localized support actually has knits together in a much bigger way. And that I think I've come to the accepting, if you will, that there's no one single organization that's gonna, that we don't need to take all of the direction from the top. But rather small teams that can act in a way that are consistent with a current challenge or problem set, a local or state or regional problem, or a functional protection of energy or utility companies and the energy sector. I mean, I think there's way more challenges than we have people. So bringing that together, I guess I'm not as, I embrace that now because I think sometimes they identify problems we didn't even know we had.
Ramesh.
Afternoon, ma'am. My question is
Hi,
based on, can you hear me here?
Again.
I'm curious about with the challenges of talent recruitment and retainment within Cyber Command, and I'm sure you saw it in Army Cyber Command, given that this is a new area where a lot of the people who are the best at this in our countries aren't necessarily drawn to join the service. Want to be in Palo Alto most likely. I'm just curious how you dealt with that when you were leading, and what you see the future is of changes that might need to be made in our policies to attract more talent.
Fantastic question. And of course, not unique to the US government. I think, many companies, particularly in the technology sector, also want to recruit and retain the best and brightest. And we are definitely in a, in a war for talent, if you will. Having said that, as I was in uniform, I cannot tell you how incredible the talent that we do have. And, even as a taxpayer, I'm so grateful that that some of that talent is committed to service and remains in uniform. The opportunity to work with the incredible team of the National Security Agency, the nation's most impressive collection of mathematicians, cryptologists. I mean, that opportunity to work with them is also, I think, a incentive to join the force in some way. So I think on the military side, though, we recognize that not everyone would want to be in uniform. So, we had to have some flexible career paths. So one, we created the cyber branch on par with infantry, artillery, aviation, a combat arms branch, recognizing that, its role in maneuver and combat. And so now we could at least recruit this specific group of people and then target our talent retention strategies for them. I think that we recognize that not everyone will join and want to serve for 30 years, which is also why we wanted to create on and off ramps for both in uniform or as a government civilian, that you could come in and out and we would recognize the talents and growth that you achieved outside with the right rank or, grade on the government side. There are definitely financial incentives associated with the highest and most difficult to retain skills, like developers. They have the military's highest bonus, which is in the six figures to join and to stay. And then I think, whether we have some talent for 4 years, for 8 years, I think like many companies, we want to maximize return on investment. So we're incentivized to put them in places where that they can, use their talents and make the most impact. And then if and when they leave, ensure that they're strategic partners with them, because, increasingly our ability to protect and defend critical infrastructure means partnership with private sector companies. So when they leave, we remain partners in a very productive way, so that we have that public and private partnership model for defense. So there's a lot of ways to serve in and out of uniform. Another reason I like that Cyber Talent Initiative, because, look, I did my time in the Army. I would absolutely go back to work in one of those agencies as a civilian. But exposure to those opportunities, getting the word out about them is also a part of, I guess, my job now, to recruit talent. Continued, I guess.
Thanks. I'm going to turn it over to Commander Clint Christoph, who is our Navy Federal Executive Fellow here in IPS.
Yeah, good evening. So my question is about, so we hear about cyberspace as kind of a new domain. So both space and cyberspace as new domains that the joint force needs to be ready to engage in operations, basically similar to ground and maritime and air. So my question is our current C2 structure set up to best capitalize on that new domain? So specifically, you mentioned some of the integration of ground effects with cyber effects, and it seems to me like our cyber, but the preponderance of our cyber forces are actually controlled by Cyber Command and are based in the United States. So I guess, is there an effort to push some of those capabilities down to the tactical level and then put them under more direct control of the regional combatant commanders or even lower down to enable better agility of the C2 structure and basically allow them to respond to conditions as they evolve? Or is that too dangerous because of the implications of some of the cyber effects that are out there?
So we've come a long way in the growth of this force and the employment of forces at every echelon. Obviously, the elevation of Cyber Command to a unified command reflects the idea that sometimes cyber operations will be the main effort, and a geographic combatant command or forward deployed task force would be in support. And then at various phases of an operation, that might shift. Obviously, the elevation of Space Command is a reflection of that, probably in the future as well. And then, I think we realized very quickly that that you can't withhold these capabilities at the highest level and have an effect and expect to have an effect on the battlefield, or actually be synchronized with ground operations, if you will, or operations in the physical domain. And so now we are fielding, I'll speak for the Army, we are fielding forces at the lowest tactical level. And we've broadened that to include not only cyber forces, but information operations specialists and electronic warfare personnel. Because I think, the idea that this domain is, it's not just IP based, it's electromagnetic spectrum, and it's the information space. So it really does require that direct relationship with a ground commander. In some cases, we train those forces at other places so that we have a collection, we can do the right thing from a training and preparation standpoint, not unlike the Navy uses, will put its linguists, its intelligence specialists when not on a ship. At places where it can continue to work a mission and then go forward. We're using that same model for the Army to ensure that even the lowest tactical commanders have the same access to those capabilities. That's a huge growth area, and we've come a long way in a little bit of time on that.
Thank you
Thanks
so much.
for the question.
So I have a couple of questions queued up anonymously in the chat. The first one is, how have cyber operations changed with the emergence of the multi-domain operations doctrine?
I think great question. I think the cyber operations have actually led the development of multi-domain operations and the idea that we can't use them separately. For a long time, we planned cyber operations, there was the operation and then there was cyber over here. And of course, cyber operations are best employed when you have a common purpose and you want to achieve, achieve effects overall, of which cyber is going to be integrated as a part of that. And as we just talked about, it's not only multi-domain, it's not only cyber, but it's also electronic warfare and information. And so, that actually has led in the development of multi-domain, because cyber is actually, when you consider it by itself, it's almost limiting. And you want people to think about, not just a physical operation, but really the entire, the holistic view of a battlefield and to include the information space.
Thanks. The next anonymous question is, do you think that current policy for planning operations, such as Joint Publications 3.0 Joint Operations, needs updates to address offensive or defensive cyber operations? If so, what changes would you propose?
I always feel like our publications in this space are always lagging, the operation, much like legislation and, laws and are sometimes lagging in how we see technology being used or proliferated. And I guess that's actually the theme of this whole talk in terms of my view as a cyber operations practitioner, that we had these great debates about doctrine and about tactics, techniques, and procedures. But in many cases, we actually had to propose an operational construct and a real use case in order to illustrate how and why. And so those operational use cases became really important. And then the publication, our joint pubs and our doctrine manuals, whether service specific or joint, then I think are able to capture what we've proposed and in some cases have done. And so they inform, and I think we've worked really hard to make them not prescriptive, but set a framework within which to plan, because the idea is, that once we've done something once that's in this space, it's going to evolve really, really quickly. So we didn't want the doctrine in this space to be so prescriptive or constraining so as not to allow some creativity and some evolution with technology or the way that we saw adversaries working. So it has to be kind of broad, and it's more a framework or like a description, and not this is the way you do things. That's a very different approach to policy and doctrine, particularly for the military, but one which the cyber domain has led and really champions.
Thank you. Our next question is going to come from Rebecca Barnes. Rebecca,
hello.
Hi, ma'am. How are you? It's been a while.
Good. Good to see you.
I'm also a War College fellow here at Carnegie Mellon
Fantastic.
College. So I've like you been in the same community dating back to 2002. So I've seen a lot of the evolution of us just rebranding the same coin over and over. I've served on the offense and defense side of the coin. And what my observations have led me to believe is that there's a challenge with communication when it comes to communicating from offensive forces to defensive forces. Defenses aren't as well supported as offensive forces in the cyber community. And then sometimes you need to bring law enforcement into the case when we see interesting activity on our networks. Obviously, I'm a federal soldier for people on the line. So we can't go outside of our own internal networks. We're not allowed. It's just one of those points we can't go past. If you were in charge for a day, how would you bridge all the gaps with all the government entities, military forces, getting that offense, defense together, plus the community or organizations in our country, because our contract partners, our service providers also make our networks vulnerable to malicious activity or interesting. I like to call it interesting activity because we can't always assume that it's not a misconfiguration. How would you overcome all these communications and who's allowed to do what challenges in the future? And I personally think it's a lot of law changes and policy and getting us all on the same network, but how would you approach it?
Well, that's like a no-win question, right? If it were easy, we would have done it. So I tend to approach these things now less as, how would I boil the ocean, but how can we make small changes that across a broad swath and over time will make a big difference. And so as we talked earlier, I think there's some really important precedents being set by law enforcement, National Guard partnership at the local and state levels, right? Because a lot of mountains have been moved to enable their participation and their support of local initiatives, whether that's defensive from a local or state government, or even again the protection of election infrastructure right now. So those are important. We've seen some important precedents in partnering with our critical services, like utility companies, electric, gas, that again, perhaps at the beginning would not have been comfortable welcoming people in uniform to look at their networks. But now, since we all are facing common adversaries, it makes sense. So those are two ways, small, but in the aggregate can make a big difference. And another reason why, like, on the private sector side, it's not lost in me that probably 80% of our country's critical infrastructure is actually operated by, or managed by private industry as opposed to U.S. government controlled. So there's got to be partnership in that space as well. A large part of which, or an important part of which, is information sharing. The government has a part of the intelligence picture. We see a part of it because we are seeing attacks, and I'll use my technology company as an example. And I want to put that picture together for a fuller understanding of, what's going on in the space. So I guess those are three ways. There is definitely a lot to be done. And I guess towards our earlier question and discussion that I think when we see a problem, trying to put together a team to solve it and propose, a way in which we might repeat it or scale it. But I think those are small things as opposed to there's not one big solution that would solve all of our problems immediately. So I don't know, I hope that's not a cop-out, but you're right, if we consider it in the aggregate, it seems insurmountable, but really I think that there's a lot of great initiatives going on in this space right now that, again, as a collective, make a difference. And I think that idea of collective defense is really important.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thanks, Rebecca.
Our next question is anonymous from the chat. How do our cyber defense teams go about making moral decisions involved with terrorism/war, i.e., how do we make decisions on the computer that could affect human lives in the physical world?
Moral. So, I think we touched on this a little bit earlier, and so I'll repeat it here because I think it's certainly worth, foot stomp and doubling down on. And this idea that there are many things which we can do in this space, but what we should do in this space is always factored into that discussion. And so, is it legal? Is it moral? Is it ethical? Can we do it technically? Should we do it as precedent? I think, from a military perspective, that's one reason why I described very deliberate planning processes, transparent coordination, precision effects, and I think that's a part of the scrutiny that goes into planning these operations. And rarely, if ever, are these the singular decision of one individual, but rather the approval for such sensitive operations are tiered at the appropriate level for that oversight and consideration.
Thanks. The next one is also from the chat. Compared to cybercom, to what extent can private sector entities like Mastercard go on the offensive to preempt cyber espionage?
We can't. And it's such an interesting space in terms of, offensive. But I will say that, I do promote and I'm a part of an offensive mindset in the defense of our infrastructure. And so, I advocate the same things that I did in uniform here with Mastercard, and that is, not only an understanding of how an adversary works, but the intent behind why they are doing something. And that understanding, I think, is important in that defense. I also think, look, there's something to be said for some basic computer hygiene and compliance. I think ISIS proved, so they were sophisticated in their use of the internet, but they were also kind of lazy in some of their cyber practices, which allowed us to break in and disrupt them, if you will. And those are the same types of things that actually make private sector companies or individuals easy targets. So I also promote that to ensure, look, if we take care of 90% of what we should do, that allows our resources, whether you're, individual at home, as a citizen, you're working at a company, I want my most, my resources to be devoted to that higher end adversary on the, that 10%. I don't want to be defending the whole thing. I just want to be defending, against the most sophisticated adversary and protect our most sensitive data or tools or capabilities. From an intelligence perspective, I also want to know what I want to protect, because I can't protect everything all the time. And so having a sense, knowing what I have and in placing layers of defense is also a part of the model that I learned as a second lieutenant and still employ today in the cybersecurity realm.
Thanks. We have another question from the chat. Do you think that artificial general intelligence, AGI, and artificial superintelligence, ASI, pose a legitimate threat either now or in the future? And if so, what do you propose we do about it? Any specific ideas about policy and regulations that should be implemented now before these technologies continue to develop?
I think this is definitely a space. So, they are threats, but they're also opportunities for us. And the idea that we can employ them for good, on the technology side, obviously it's about a customer experience. It's about, empowering layering our defenses. But I think this is also a case where we're going to see some policy lag because of a lack of understanding of what it can do and where it's going. So I think that's kind of one of those policy and legal challenges that shaping it in advance of, or at least in parallel with, I think in consideration of employment of those is important. Highlighting first use cases in operational employment is also in a way that that people can understand, so they can be thoughtful and careful about crafting policy in this space. I tend to, obviously, I think some of our technologies that we use in our daily lives and take for granted today, in many cases, in some cases, originally intended for good, but now being used and purposed differently. So I think that, we are, at least as a group, more thoughtful about not only how can it benefit us, but how can we also put in place thoughtful policy that helps combat the misuse of it, if you will.
Thanks. We have a comment on our YouTube video, so I'm going to relay that. When you kicked off Operation Glowing Symphony, did ISIS ever try to deploy any countermeasures to protect their online presence against U.S. Cyber Command's actions?
So they did, but I think, when you, one of the things that you consider is, and I like the way that the NPR piece kind of drew this out, that, ultimately this is about people. So when you can't log into your account and you're entering your password and it doesn't work, your first thought is not Cyber Command is after me. I think it was, I'm going to answer my questions and try to reset my password. I'm going to call my admin and get some help. He's having trouble too. Why is this happening? Well, you're incompetent. And it started like this. It actually fermented. It wasn't Cyber Command is doing this. It was more like, what's going on? I don't trust the people I'm working with because I can't do what I need to. And that fostering that arguments across the network of administrators and trusted users in this space was actually the intent, because this is a group of people. So I like the way that it influenced the behavior in a way that most of us would recognize, because we've forgotten our passwords. We've tried to reset it. We can't get on our, we can't log in. We can't do something we wanted to with a file. Again, your immediate reaction is not someone is doing this offensively. It's more frustration, and that has a tendency to build on itself, which was exactly the intended effect. And it worked in a big way. So, you started to see, oh, I have to protect this, or, I collapsed accounts and things like that. So that is, look, wasting time is a really great cyber effect. Because if I'm wasting your time, you're not producing, you're not working in these nefarious ways. So we kind of employed that technique, and it's really effective.
Thanks. The next question from the chat is, how can we make cyberspace safer? Do you think that international agreements could hinder certain destructive cyber attacks, such as attacks on critical infrastructure?
The subject of great policy debates today. So I think it's interesting too, that, look, I think there are some really important precedents being set in this space. And I think in some cases we see, for example, Europe leading in the regulation of data use, of privacy. I think those things ultimately help. The safer piece, yes. And I think the collection of like-minded groups. So we have, like, I'm a part of the financial services infrastructure community of interest. And so we share best practices because we all realize that that we are invested in our safety as an industry. There are 16 different sectors like this that come together both domestically and internationally to ensure safe and best practices. I think those are some of the more effective things than mandates per se, because it's really for every thing we put in place, there's probably there's so many exceptions. So I like the coming together of these communities of interest, if you will, industry specific, again, nationally and internationally. And I think that's proven really, really effective. It also fosters information exchange on who's targeting and what's happening. So from that shared intelligence picture, I think that's helpful as well.
Thanks. We have time for one more question if anyone wants to ask one. And one just came through. Is there concern that DoD's use of commercial resources such as cloud computing or satellite communications could make targets of those civilian resources?
I like such a great question, and it's great to close on this too. This is one where the military and Department of Defense's use of cloud and emerging technologies is right there alongside of the private sector and industry. So we are going to face the same challenges, and the same things that I'm concerned about with, at my company are the same things that the U.S. government is concerned about as well. So we're going to share best practices across the government and private sector, because we're all learning as we deploy these emerging capabilities. We also layer in, I'll say compliance, but it's much more than that in terms of defense of those emerging capabilities.
Thank you so much.
I think the department just published its data principles today as well, and I thought, oh, I'm gonna repurpose those for my own job. So this is a great space to share, because we're all kind of deploying these in parallel.
Any final thoughts, Brigadier General Buckner?
I don't. Well, I do actually. Ali, thanks for your the invitation and hosting this this event. I again applaud Carnegie Mellon for its leadership in this space, the thought leadership and the cultivating talent that I know will serve in different ways, whether that's a part of the military, the government, or even in the private sector. And your commitment to service and thought leadership in this space, I applaud. Thank you so much. And I've included a couple links, and I urge you that if you are at all inclined for any type of service, I'm sure that there's a way that we can match that with an opportunity in many different hats. So I appreciate the platform, and good luck to all of you.
Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your service. Thank you for your time. We really appreciated having you here today, both in the roundtable discussion earlier this afternoon and here in this public lecture. For those of you who joined us this afternoon, thank you for being here. Our next event is next Thursday, October 22nd. We are having a special professional journey discussion with CMU English professor Jason England, who will talk to us about his journey and his path. And to find out more about all of our events, please follow us on social media. We're at CMU IPS everywhere. And thank you again. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Take care.